Muy buenas tardes. Good evening. This is I am absolutely impressed. This is a very unusual setup, and I'm going to explain why. Because it's not normally to be seated here in un banco. How you call it?
A bench.
Bench. No, park bench. Park bench.
Bench, yeah.
It's not a church bench, in any case. Well, the reason is that today we are launching an institutional campaign of communication, which is called Democracy in Motion. And it's under the auspices of España Global. You know well that is an institution that has been set in Spain, and I'm going to be extremely candid because it's well known, in order to face the challenge of a very well-organized campaign of disinformation about Spain. And at a certain moment, the government has decided that things has to say that Spain is not a democracy, that human rights are not respected, that there are political prisoners, could not continue to be silenced. And they decided to launch this campaign, but to launch this campaign not only to speak about this issue of the independence in Catalonia, no, on the contrary. To launch a campaign about, I don't know, it's another of the titles, España, Real Spain. What happens really in Spain? And in order to do that, the best thing is to explain what are the main features of the present Spain, which of course are very different from how was Spain 40 or 50 years ago. And in order to do that, today we are launching the campaign there are 4 short videos explaining, for instance, and today we are going to see the first one about the freedom of expression in Spain. There is another one about feminism and diversity. Another one about which is a subject that is now very much in the mind of all Spaniards, the life in inland Spain, in the villages of Spain, which is a very important part of us. And as well, there are another one about research. You say, why research? Because research is a symbol of modernization. No? And at the same time, we'll have as well short piezas, I don't know how you say that, spots about images of what you can see in Spain. And for instance, I've seen one, and it's the coexistence, the normal coexistence of the 4 co-official languages in Spain. We must be one of the few countries in the world where there are 4 official languages that are spoken in a very natural way. Other spots about in something that we have been pioneer, the same-sex marriages. Another one about flags, where you can see the Republican flag and the constitutional flag, and they are at the same time very freely, and the region's flag, etc. So all these things are going to be started today, but we are going to make as well presentation in a Cañada Blanche, an Instituto Cervantes, etc. But the videos you've seen are made sat in a bench, in un banco, in a conversation between 2 relevant persons of the Spanish society. And we have thought that the best way to explain it to you is to replicate that, but with our British friend. Well, Argelia, she comes from Barcelona, but and Tim will present them. The only thing I'm going to say is to thank them to come here with a very short notice, and to say that the common feature they have, all of them, is first a wonderful curriculum. They are very independent persons. They are going to follow the curriculum. And second, they know very well Spain. I think this is a common feature of them, and they have a long perspective. And in order to moderate this talk, we have Tim. And I have to present him. So to present the presenter.
Thank you.
The first thing is he comes from the BBC. And I have to say that the BBC has, and this is a very diplomatic thing, has never been soft with the Spanish government.
I've heard actually that,
Yeah.
that several people in the embassy
Sí.
were switching off BBC
So,
coverage.
Not only, no, not in my case. On the contrary, 24 hours, 24. That I can be sure. No, but this is a compliment. It's not a criticism. So it's a compliment, but it's in order to explain to the audience that. And he's at the same time. You are not a war correspondent, but almost. You are in all the events, breaking news, etc. So he's really he's really on the ground. But at the same time, he knows very well Spain because he will tell us, but he has been traveling since 30 years. He's older than he looks like. He knows Spain from 35 years or so. And he knows all the political life in Spain. What happened and what is happening now, because he has covered, you told me you cover precisely like the events in October last 2 years. But he has two things, and I finish there, that are not absolutely common in British. First thing is a British that he speaks a very good Spanish.
Ojalá.
Sí, no, bastante bien, lo he comprobado, because the 19 million of tourists that go to Spain, not all of them speak as well as him. And the other thing, he knows Spanish cuisine, but classical. And I hope, and I finish with that, you are not in favor of paella with chorizo. No.
Not at all.
Well, Tim, thank you very much for coming here. And now, you are the master of ceremonies.
Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, welcome to you all this evening. I'm not going to really sort of start my preamble until we've seen the short video that the Ambassador was talking about. I'd like us all, though, to think that this is our sort of fantasy banco in the Retiro Park on a warm autumnal evening, which of course is the complete opposite of what we're facing here in Britain at the moment. But we have four very distinguished guests who know Spain intimately, much better than I do. And after we've seen this video, I'd like to introduce them all to you, and then we'll start the debate. We aim to run for about an hour, and that will include about 15 minutes of questions at the end. So I'm hoping for it to be quite an interactive debate, so you can put your opinions, ask specific questions to our panel. But I think let's first just start with the first video that the Ambassador was talking about. As the Ambassador was saying, I mean, I read Filología Española at Durham University many years ago. And recently, I've been flitting backwards and forwards to Spain for pleasure and for work, and most recently for the Catalan crisis in 2017, for the elections there, also for the national elections back in April. I'm back in November as well. And every time I sort of travel back from Spain, I always look back at how I saw Spain in the late 1970s. And what strikes me that for a country of such diverse regions, passions, political fissures, but also things that unite Spain as well, it always reminds me how similar, funnily enough, Spain is from the golden age that I studied when I was doing Filología Española. So when I went to Durham University, I was taught by the great Professor Dan Rogers, and one of the first plays we did was Fuente Ovejuna by Lope de Vega, which was, of course, extremely modern and challenging when it was first written, but those universal themes of good governance, loyalty, justice, the meaning of honor, trust, sacrifice is rank confined just to the nobility? How does individual responsibility influence society to work together for the common good? And that debate from Fuente Ovejuna by Lope de Vega from the Golden Age continues into modern-day Spain. And if you forgive me, I will be speaking today in English, as I think most of our panel as well. Les puedo asegurar que saldrá mejor así, ¿no? Porque, como se dice el frase castellano, no hay mal que por bien más venga, ¿no? Entonces, no venga. Entonces, because I don't want you to understand or try and decipher some of my Spanglish. But I do want this to be a sort of interactive occasion. We've missed the debate, but I think the idea is that the bench seat is a piece of public furniture. It's a place to sit down with friends, to agree, to disagree, and debate. And it's a symbol, really, of friendship. And all of us here tonight are, because we love Spain, because we are concerned sometimes with the way Spain is going, but it doesn't mean to say that we are critical of what is happening in Spain. Dame Denise Holt, former British ambassador to Mexico and Spain, Mark Damazer, head of St. Peter's College, Oxford, formerly of ITN, and the BBC, where he was controller of Radio 4, a great Hispanophile, speaks many other languages, and has picked up Spanish really at the end of many of the other Romance languages, and of course German. Professor Trevor Dadson, Emeritus Professor of Hispanic Studies, Editor-in-Chief of the Hispanic Research Journal, and Dr. Argelia Queralt Ph.D, a PhD in Law, Associate Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Barcelona. And before we sort of begin some of the issues I want to sort of drill down in, I wondered if we could just start with 2 minutes from each of you about how you see Spain today.
Thank you very much, Tim. So I see Spain today through a lens or a prism which goes back 40 years or more. I first visited Spain, really I shouldn't be confessing this, but in 1968. And it was part of my degree studies in Bristol. And the reason why it remains very clearly 1968 is I remember being in a cafe in Barcelona eating the chicken and chips, which was all we could afford, and the television was on, and there were terrible scenes of rioting and fighting between protesters and police, and it turned out to be Northern Ireland. And we were all completely shocked and aghast that in the time between us leaving the United Kingdom to be in Spain and then, practically war had broken out in Northern Ireland. And so I've always been conscious, because at the same time, more or less on the same time scale, of course, troubles erupted in the Basque country. And I've always been rather conscious of these train tracks that the United Kingdom and Spain have been on, which never quite cross and never quite meet, but things seem to happen slightly in parallel. Anyway, fast forwarding a few years from 1968, I joined the Foreign Office as a research officer and had the enormous luxury of following the transition of Spain all the way through from 1970 to 1984, paid to read the Spanish newspapers, which was a fantastic treat. But what struck me was that practically everybody expected things to go badly wrong when Franco died. And I think it's really important that we remember, although it's now 40 years ago, how febrile the atmosphere was. It was pretty much the peak of Euro-communism. Everybody expected that Europe would collapse under the strain, or at least that Spain might. There were no great expectations of King Juan Carlos, in all honesty, and there was no understanding of how anybody could translate a dictatorship which had been in place for so very long into a functioning democracy. And I remember one of my colleagues in the embassy saying, the day after Franco dies, there'll be 6 million communists in the street. It turned out, as time went on, that what Spaniards wanted, which is what most of us want most of the time, is a calm life, a job, and a political system that is fair as it can be, with a legal system that you can trust. And actually, Juan Carlos, if I may say so, in my opinion, was one of the great architects of that, because it was his choice to appoint Adolfo Suárez, and Adolfo Suárez was the person who, at first, everybody thought was an error, was an apparatchik, and he turned out to be the man who was able to introduce a democratic constitution, and people voted for it in their millions. And when I get to that point, I want to just underline that those people were also Basque people and were also Catalan people. The entire nation voted overwhelmingly for that referendum. Admittedly, in order to get to a point where everybody could vote overwhelmingly, some points were fudged. And so when you ask me, Tim, how do I interpret Spain now? I think we are at the point where enough people have forgotten what civil war and what dictatorship meant, and the fudges that were in the Constitution are beginning to be difficult and need focus.
That's a very good point, I think, just to stop from that introduction.
Absolutely. More than 2 minutes,
coming to that in a minute. Mark.
In 1975, I was at Cambridge in a lecture about Machiavelli, and I deliberately sat next to the girl I wanted to go out with, enormously attractive in every way, and in the middle of the lecture, the lecturer announced that Franco had died, and the girl said, "This is very, very bad news." She was a fan of Franco. And that was the end of my relationship with her. My first child was conceived in Spain, though not born in Spain, for which I would desperately like a Spanish passport now. I then subsequently became and was privileged and honored a tertuliano. So I met Denise there, and I've been going to Spain on a regular basis as part of the British-Spanish set of discussions. But the broader point, which Denise makes, but I want to emphasize, is that it's innate, inherent in democratic liberalism to be shrouded in anxiety and skepticism, and to be dealing with one crisis after another in a raucous and vulgar and pluralist democracy, which is what Spain is. Cast your mind back to 1975 and on, and what's happened in the last 40 plus years in Spain is an absolute triumph of all the values which now appear to be so vulnerable. It's a triumph of political democracy. It's a triumph of political liberalism. It's a triumph of internationalism. It's a triumph of tolerance. It's a triumph for a mixed economy. And if you look back at my childhood and think of what Spain was, the resistance to even learning the Spanish language, because it was associated with repression and extreme authoritarianism and Francoism, and you look at it now, none of this applies. So we'll come on and we can talk about the problems, of which Catalonia is only one of many. And we can talk about structural unemployment, and we should. And we can talk about technological innovation, and we should. And we can talk about the danger that the populist left and the populist right might cause in Spain. But none of it should be without understanding the extent to which there has been a genuine, brilliantly maintained and sustained political and economic miracle within the European Union, which is where Spain is lodged in the public imagination now.
And we will come on to all those subjects. Mark, Argelia.
Well, if I had to describe, well, I have to describe Spain today, I would say that it is a democracy, imperfect as every democracy is. We are a democracy based in the rule of law. We have separation of powers. We have a very developed system of fundamental rights, including individual, democratic, and social rights. We have an independent judiciary, and then we are a very high decentralized country. We are a very plural country with 17 regions. And as we were saying before, we have 4 co-official languages. Regarding rights, I would say that I would like to point out that, for instance, we were, I think, the 4th or the 5th country around the world recognizing the same-sex marriage in 2003. We have a very developed toolkit defending gender rights. We have a law, an integral law system, an integral law fighting gender violence, which, as you know, is a problem that we all are facing. Then we have this integral law of equality between men and women. that has introduced the, for instance, the principle of gender balance. Has introduced this principle of gender balance into politics, and our electoral list have to be 40–60% of each sex, and if the political parties do not respect this percentage, the list will be null. So they will be out of the elections, and. Just to the last thing, I would say that regarding also the rights of women, for instance, I have read yesterday or 2 days ago, I read that Spain right now is, I have it here, the current government, the Spanish current government is the cabinet with more women in ministerial positions. So also the rights of women have been developing a lot into within the Spanish system. And just the last thing, just to do a picture of the Spanish system, we have the fourth best health system in the world. So I think it's quite interesting to highlight these elements.
Thank you very much. All very positive. But in terms of social inequality and social mobility, that might be an area we want to talk about later on. Trevor, just a couple of minutes, if you would, and then we'll from you as well.
Well, I think I hold the record. I first went to Spain in 1964. And between now and then, it's completely unrecognizable. I mean, the country that I visited, I was 16 years old. The country I visited, you just bear no relationship to the country that it has now become, which I think is a miracle what has happened. I was also there when I kept going back. I've been going back almost every year. I mean, I've married a Spaniard. My children, they can have a Spanish passport. I can't. They can have an Irish passport because they were born in Belfast. I can't. So sadly, I shall be the family pariah when we travel around the world, where as we are, as a nation, let's at least accept we are the pariahs of Europe. They will be able to travel happily everywhere with their Spanish and Irish passports. So I would beg the Spanish government to give me the chance of a Spanish passport as the husband and father of Spaniards. I was there in '68, like Denise. I remember being in Spain, because I studied Spanish and Portuguese. I remember particularly being in Spain when the Portuguese dictatorship fell a year before. Yeah. And I was in Salamanca. At the university, I was working at the university in Salamanca, and I can remember vividly the reaction of my Spanish colleagues to the fact that Portugal had got rid of its dictatorship first. They felt really angry about this and really upset that Portugal, this little country on the edge, had actually got rid of its dictatorship first. I was then in Durham, as it happened, when Franco died. And I can remember that evening when the news came through vividly, thinking at last that the nightmare was over. It never, I have to say, maybe I was very naive. It never occurred to me that there would be a problem. I just did not see. Couldn't say I could see that Spain would move almost seamlessly into a democracy. But it just seemed to, even during the 70s, it was obvious that the country was changing. The country had changed, the government hadn't. I think that was a situation where the political system was running way behind what was actually happening on the ground. And I think that goes a long way to explaining, I think, the success of the transition. I think there were problems with the transition. I think the amnesia, to call it that, the lack of memory, is quite terrifying, actually, particularly because I used to teach a lot of Erasmus students from Spain. I had to teach them Spanish history, recent Spanish history. They had absolutely no idea of the Civil War, the pre-Civil War, the Republic, the repression, or anything. This was a complete emptiness in their memory, and I think that is a problem, and it is still a problem, the lack of a sort of historical coming to terms with memory. I think the decentralization has gone far too far. Because I ask myself often, what is the point of having a central government? It seems to do nothing. It controls almost nothing. So, I think those are issues which are now coming back to bite, the current political class. But it has been an incredible success. I started learning Spanish when I was 13. I've loved every minute of it during my entire life. There's nearly 60 years I've been learning, studying Spanish, living Spanish. Sometimes I'm never sure what language I'm speaking and which mindset I'm in. I think it's a wonderful country. I love Spaniards. And I think whatever happens, it will succeed. It will pull through, because I think that it has inner resources, a strength, which are quite remarkable.
Great. So we've got an idea of where our panelists stand regarding sort of modern Spain. When I first went there, the big problem, of course, in Spain was Esta and the campaign of violence. And then, there was a peace solution. Esta has now disbanded. And I wondered if we could just look at secessionism and the Basque crisis. Mark, come and sit next to me here, if that's probably easier so people can see you. But what was it in the national psyche, do you think, that brought about, obviously Kofi Annan and Zapatero were involved earlier on, but what was it that allowed Spain to come together, to forgive, and in a way forget from what had been such a bloody conflict on Spanish soil?
Terrorism is normally a manifestation of weakness and not of strength. Terrorists don't have the legitimate apparatus of the state. Terrorists can't raise taxes. Terrorists normally don't have the military materiel and resource to trouble nation states with proper bureaucracies and proper administrative structures. Democracies are stronger than they know and are stronger than they feel, and they're a great deal stronger than the contemporary debate which surrounds each and every issue that democracies have to contend with. And so it was in the Basque Country, that in the end, the terrorists were never going to be strong enough to beat the Spanish state. They weren't going to mobilize the weapons, they weren't going to mobilize the structures, they weren't going to mobilize enough popular support. I wouldn't say that it was inevitable that ETA was going to crumble, but I was in no way surprised. And just as the IRA, which in some ways was a stronger organization than ETA for various reasons, couldn't in the end achieve a military victory over the British state, so it will be with ETA, and it therefore was no surprise to me that the Spanish state won out against ETA, but it brings, I think, a larger issue to focus, which was hinted at the very beginning by the ambassador and to some extent by Trevor. Decentralization versus centralization. All of these debates are inevitably going to end up with a mess. There is no scientific rule book or precision which tells you how to deal with separatist movements, whether they're violent or non-violent. It's a matter of political compromise, a matter of political discussion, and a matter of accepting the fact that you will never get a perfectly crystalline way of expressing autonomous and devolved rights within a nation state. That seems to me, and I know we'll come to it, so I won't deal with it now, the absorbing lesson that I think that the Spanish state needs to come to terms with when it's dealing with Catalonia, but they have a track record. In the end, ETA came and ETA went.
Denise, but there was political tension over that. There was a division, wasn't there, between the two main political parties at the time. The Partido Popular, for example, had this policy of crispación, and they were actively seeking not to engage in dialogue with ETA. And does that represent, in your view, a significant percentage of Spanish society at the time, and now perhaps a sleeping percentage of Spanish society, which perhaps doesn't have a voice in quite the same way that the other parts do?
I'm not sure I feel qualified to give you an answer to the second part of the question. Maybe, maybe not. Time will tell. I think my feeling is that most people at most times prefer peace in the end, and that in the case of ETA, I mean, events change perspectives. We had the Atocha event, which inevitably caused greater tension for a period. When I arrived in Spain as ambassador, understanding the process by which the Good Friday Agreement had come to being, because enough time had passed to think, well, we have to move on. And my own feeling is that actually the political process, rather as Mark is suggesting, the political process wins out because, if you like, in the Basque Country, as in Northern Ireland, political leaders who were of that persuasion join the fraternity of politicians. They become part of it. They take ownership. And maybe not very much ownership, but they become associated with it. And so I think it's a question of time. I think it's very difficult to resolve a regional conflict on any particular timetable because it's always possible to overthrow it. 2 men and a gun can upset the apple cart. But over time, the inevitability of a political solution rather than a military one does the job.
And Trevor, just talking about the Northern Ireland peace process, because Jonathan Powell, who was obviously engaged in that for Tony Blair, John Major, of course, at the inception of that, but he wrote just after, I think, the ETA crisis was resolved, that he thought there was a risk of the government's approach in Catalonia now could tip Spain into another period of political violence. Now, there hasn't been any political violence in Catalonia really so far, but is that too far-fetched, do you think?
I don't know. I remember somebody saying to me quite recently, it struck me at the time, I hadn't thought of it this way, and reminded and said, well, you have to remember that the Basques, apart from ETA, have never been a problem. There was no violence in the Basque country previously. The Basques had always been well integrated into Spain. They've always had a fair degree of autonomy, has to be said, with their fiscal pact and so on, under Franco as well as afterwards, and people forget that. The Basques and the Catalans were treated far better by Franco than if you lived in Extremadura or Andalusia, where you really did feel the force of repression. And said that actually, the real problem that has been since the 19th century in Spain is the incorporation of Catalonia. The violence in Catalonia in the end of the 19th and early 20th century was significant, and that people, ETA made people forget that there's been a much longer problem with Catalonia than there has with the Basque country. I lived for 12 years in Northern Ireland, not necessarily the totally worst, but pretty awful, between 78 and 90. And when we left, if somebody had said to me in 7 years there will be a peace process, I would have laughed my head off. There was absolutely no sense at all in the 80s there was ever going to be a peace process. Now, from my perspective, and you will say I'm wrong, at the end of the day, the IRA came to that table because the SAS and the military had infiltrated to such an extent they were losing so many of their operatives, so many of their terrorists, that they were just knocking them off. They got control of the IRA. The IRA didn't go to the peace table because it felt this was a good thing. It had no choice. I don't think we should lose sight of that. They were dragged there, in a way, because they were being beaten. Now, I don't know enough of the ETA situation, and of course there was all the problem of the GAO and so on. But I don't think there's any doubt that fighting the IRA back on their terms, they came to that peace table. And yes, some of their leaders decided to join the peace process, but I don't think it was a moment of illumination.
And I think the Spanish government would argue the same in terms of the fight against ETA, in terms of the intelligence and the...
Well, I think it was France coming in. I think it was
Exactly.
a moment that France actually took seriously the problem and started handing them over. That's when ETA realized its days were numbered. It was up until that moment, I think, France had behaved abominably before then. But once France took the decision to step in, ETA's days were numbered.
Just on the
there was
point-
no hiding place.
Yeah, but on the point of what Jonathan Powell made about perhaps potentially tipping the Catalonian crisis into that, Argelia, I just wondered what you thought, because of course we've got the verdicts for the 12, the two Jordis, Oriol Junqueras, due any time now. There is an argument in the international press, an argument promulgated by certain working committees within the UN, but not official UN policy, that this was arbitrary detention, and that the idea of modern democracies not actually locking up democratically elected politicians just because they argue for independence. Now, I mean, you are a law professor, you're based there, your children go to school there. I mean, what is your argument to counter that?
Well, actually, they are not in prison because they were defending independence. They are in prison because they act illegally in order to defend independence. So it's not a question of freedom of expression, it's a question of not respecting the legal order, which is a big difference. So 2 years ago, in the Catalan parliament, we had a rupture with the constitutional legal order. So there were 2 laws were passed that were clearly against the Constitution, and actually the Constitutional Court 2 or 3 months later said so. So they used illegal tools. They used tools that were clearly contrary to the Constitution, to the rights of the rest of the MPs, of the parliamentarians, because the procedure in order to pass those laws was just invented in that moment, because even the law clerks of the parliament were saying, no, we cannot pass these laws because they are against the Constitution, so be careful, it has consequences, and so on. But the pro-independence leaders at the parliament, they decided to go on. So they decided to go on knowing which the consequences could be. So we can discuss on the proportionality, opportunity of having these people on prison on remand, but we cannot say that, I mean, it's not true that there is, they are in jail because they are trying to express themselves, so it's not true.
Mark, how do you see that? Because the optics in 2017, you know, we were all there, were not good, and actually the separatists used that very efficiently in terms of their storytelling, reaching out to the international press.
Let's go back to first principles. A great deal of politics is around the issue of what is the appropriate unit for self-determination. Is the appropriate unit for self-determination the whole of the island of Ireland, or is it just Northern Ireland? Is the appropriate unit of self-determination the population of Gibraltar, or is it the population of Spain and the peninsula? Is the unit of self-determination Quebec, or is it all of Canada? There is nothing unique around having within a geographical landmass a population that feels its identity to be different. It's also not entirely rational. Nationalism is not a rational force. If it was all decided by economics, then life would be much simpler. Let me give an Oxford story. I have 2 remarkable professors. I have a professor of economics who is from Madrid, and I have a professor of physical geography from Barcelona. They are 2 of the cleverest, nicest people you could wish to meet. Their politics are centre-left, their every social attitude is liberal. They are internationalist, they are tolerant. They happen both to be secular. The Catalan went home to vote in the referendum and feels himself to be a Catalan. If I explain to him that economically he may be less well off, that Catalonia won't be recognized by the European Union or the United Nations, he says, I know that, but in the end, I am a Catalan. He speaks perfect Spanish, he speaks perfect English, he speaks perfect French. I am a Catalan. So that is what you're dealing with. And when I said 10 minutes ago that there is no rule book, it's because each and every one of these problems has its own dynamic and ebbs and flows. And I'm not here to say for one moment what my advice would be to the government in Madrid as to what the right balance is between autonomy and centralization, what the right balance is in language rights, what the right balance is in ensuring that a curriculum is properly grounded in evidence and fairness. None of this can I explain in a Spanish context. But it is obvious that if a government goes too far in one direction or another, and the danger is more likely to be in the direction of severe measures and anxiety and neurosis than it is the other way around, then it clearly risks enfranchising or empowering people who might otherwise not be sympathetic to a separatist and nationalist cause. I don't say that because I'm an advocate of Catalonian secession, not one bit of it, but I say that as an analytically obvious point, that if there is an overreaction around a set of policies which make people who might otherwise be skeptical, partisan in favor of the separatists or nationalists, that must be a real danger. And it's not for me to say whether it applies to a particular case or not. Just one addendum that comes out of my experience in the tertulias is that I was speaking to a couple of journalists from El País, as it happens, who both felt, although passionately themselves, in favor of the integrity of Spain as a whole, and deeply worried and anxious, and indeed hostile to the prospects of Catalonian secession. They were worried about the status of the Constitutional Court and whether it was quite as rigorously impartial as it needed to be when dealing with issues around Catalonia. I don't know the answer to that. I merely relay it as their question.
And the Audiencia Nacional, for example, which has hangovers from the Franco period. Trevor or Denise, who wants to come in on that?
I wanted to come in from a slightly different perspective on the constitutionality. As somebody who in recent months has felt increasingly anxious over the fact that we don't have a written constitution in this country, and was intensely relieved to find that the Supreme Court had managed to scrape enough together to give us one. And I think what I would say on the constitution is Spain does have a written constitution, and it was very transparently negotiated. It's been amended on several occasions over the years, and it was, as I said in my introduction, voted in a very overwhelming referendum vote. And I think for the time that that is the constitution in force, then it must be implemented.
Just, Argelia, you were looking slightly skeptical.
Yeah, well, I think that we need more. I mean, we need an in-depth reform of the Constitution.
Absolutely.
But I think that that's a different, I would say it's a different debate. So
Exactly.
we cannot abuse of the failures of the Constitution, the nowadays failures of the Constitution, just to defend that Spain is not a democracy, that is, it would be the leitmotif of the pro-independence leaders. So I think one of the problems of this pro-independence movement has been that everything has been put into a pot, shaked, and how would you say, and lanzado, no? Yeah. And so everything is mixed. There is not the possibility of separate every element and every debate. So that's why, but you have to reform the Constitution. You don't reform the Constitution, so you are not a democracy, so you have political prisoners. So, and there is no common thread on this story. So.
Trevor, do you believe in the integrity of the judicial system in Spain? Do you think that all Spaniards can trust it?
I think it has problems. I've always felt it has problems, and I think the biggest problem, the three pillars of a democracy are, if I can remember correctly, an independent parliament, control over the executive, and independent judiciary. I'm not sure that the judiciary is wholly independent because the politicians choose the judges. And I think that is a major issue. I don't think politicians should be choosing any judges, quite frankly, because I think politicians are the worst people to choose judges. And we know what they do. The PSOE has so many it can choose. PP has so many it can choose. As the Consejo General is completely at the moment paralyzed because they can't agree on the quotas. Well, if they didn't have quotas to start with, if they weren't involved in the process, there would be no paralysis. I think the judges should be appointed completely independently of Parliament. But that's my...
Yeah, let me say that 99% of judges in Spain are, are judges because they go through a opposition right? So they are not appointed by the government. Those appointed by the government and the parliament are the members of the Consejo General del Poder Judicial and el Consejo General del Poder, the General Council of the Judiciary is designating few but important, that's true, judges of the Supreme Court. Yeah. But I mean, just to make it clear, 90% or 99% of judges in Spain are not elected by the politicians.
Okay, right. Okay. No, I mean, to pick up the point about, I mean, I was in Spain when what I consider was a golpe de Estado, quite frankly, on the 6th and 7th of September. The Catalan parliament carried out a coup d'etat, passing laws that were completely unconstitutional. There's no, that's quite clear. If you have a written constitution, that is the constitution you have. And and there's no doubt it makes it quite clear that the only referendum that you can have in Spain is for the entire country. You cannot have a referendum in separate parts of it. It can only be over the... Now, if they want to change that, then they need to get agreement to change it. Frankly, if I was an independentista Catalan, I would go for a nationwide referendum, because I think most of Spain is so heartily sick of them, they would actually vote to go and say, go, please just leave us alone. Go and sink economically, because they would sink economically.
Okay, well, that'll be good to raise to the floor.
That's a personal...
I want to move on. We spent a long time talking about secessionism, Catalan, Eta and everything else. The Spanish economy, after 2 recessions in a decade, now the economic exemplar, described, I think, as such by the FT recently. But still, according to the OECD, it says it would take a Spaniard born into a low-income family today 4 generations to reach the country's average income. Millions still fated by birth will never climb the social elevator. Now why is that, Mark? Or
Well, let me do that a slightly different way. The first reaction to the crash in Spain, or the first set of consequences for Spain, were less severe than they were for the UK, because the integrity of the Spanish banking system, one of the institutions of contemporary Spain, which was properly grounded, well established and very well run, held out against the degree of banking and financial sector irresponsibility that took place in the UK and the US and elsewhere. But then, as it turned out, you obviously had this enormous problem with property prices and a bust, and all the way through, you had a really big problem with youth unemployment, which, although the headline figure is exaggerated in the UK press, nevertheless is very serious. You have the problem that Tim's been pointing out about social mobility in Spain being as bad, if not worse, than it is in the UK, where it's plenty bad enough. And yet, the degree of populism that you're enduring in Spain is arguably less than we're enduring in the UK, and the system either of family sets of responsibilities and embedded community values, or the welfare state as it's exercised in Spain, has been sufficient until this point to buttress Spain from the worst kind of political reaction and the worst kind of populist demagoguery that you see elsewhere. Now, I don't think it's a miracle. I mean, these systems cost money. They require institutional solidity and sobriety in order to be properly run. But thus far, and this is the point, thus far it's been enough to get Spain through, and not, it seems to me, to imperil the political structures which now look to me to be sufficiently embedded. But if you're forever lumbered with the degree of structural unemployment that you've got amongst the young, and open brackets, the more energetic, and if the social mobility and education systems, which don't seem yet adequate enough to propel greater opportunity to those people who feel left behind, if that isn't susceptible to improvement in the next 20 or 30 years, I think that that is a long-term problem. I don't think ticking time bomb is right. I don't think it's inevitable, but it's a clear structural weakness in Spanish democracy.
And Denise, I mean, do you share Mark's view? I mean, that is quite significant, isn't it? 4 generations to get to a median income. I mean, far worse than it is in the UK, I think.
brightest and best are either in London or other capital cities, because they sense either that there's more future for them here or that it's more exciting. So that's one problem. Secondly, I often wondered whether one of the problems for the Spanish economy was that it had inherited these big state-run enterprises, which over time have evolved into very big privately run enterprises. And then you have the family firms at the bottom, and there was not quite enough in the middle. And I suspect that that is growing, but that may be a factor. And then you just have the fact that Spain is so enormous and quite empty in the middle. And so infrastructure has been traditionally a problem. I would say less of a problem, and in part thanks to the European Union. And one of the reasons why the European Union is rightly seen as an asset for Spain is that there are now much better communications. But you know, these various things have militated against rapid transformation of the prospects for young people.
And Trevor, women doing so much better. I mean, women's rights significant in Spain. One hears the role of women debated constantly, but still 15th, I think, Spain is rated in terms of gender equality at the moment. I mean, in the years that you've known Spain, I mean, there has been an explosion in sort of rights, hasn't there, between, in terms of gender equality and the role of women, not only within the family, but within society as well.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, there's been an enormous change. I think the percentage of women working is still much lower than it is in the UK, where it's very, very high. That's probably more a response to poor salaries that, you know, most, say, young families that I know both have. There is no way that the woman can stay at home. You can't pay a mortgage, you can't live on some of the salaries. And that's also very much, I think, a key in Spain. Salaries are generally much lower. Many of them are, you know, I mean, I talked to a young cousin who said, when they talked about mil euristas, and he said, ojalá que me pagaran 1,000 euros. You know, now it's gone down to 700, 800. So I think there is, as Mark said, there is a real problem of structural unemployment. That at the best that Spain has ever got to, I think, is around about 8% unemployment. That is seen as really incredible to get down to about 8%. When the crash started here, 2008, people were panicking when unemployment started to go up to 8%, and it hovered around 8% and then went back down again, because we're used to unemployment at around, what, 5% or just under. So that's always seemed to me a major issue, is how, you know, when Prime Minister Rajoy happily said, I'm going to create 2 million jobs, and I was listening to him on the television, and I thought, a ver, hijo, a ver, ¿cómo? ¿Cómo y dónde? You know, to say, I'm going to create 2 million jobs, well, that's brilliant, dead easy. Where are they going to come from? Who's going to be, you know, where are they going to be placed? And I think that's been a long-term problem. It was there. Yes, it was there under Franco. I mean, those of us who remember the pluriempleo, you know, almost everybody was doing various jobs because each job was so, you know, poorly paid. And I don't think that's altered significantly. I also think the fact that Spain has lost so many young people to other European, which is great for us, but we haven't had to pay for their education. We haven't paid for all of the things that they've done. We're getting the benefit, which is, okay, that's great, but it's not great for Spain, and I think there's a real issue. I think, going very finally, I think one of the reasons that comes along, I know this from talking to people, is you can set up your own business within 24 hours. You can get finance, you can get it all through the paperwork, and in 24 hours you can have your own company as a startup. It can take you months and months and months in Spain, and the process goes on for so long that people give up. I remember reading two Galicians who actually, after about 9 months of total frustration, came to London, and the next day they had their business. Now, that has to change. You cannot, I think, expect to run a 21st century economy with all the bureaucracy, the paperwork, the paper going here, there, and everywhere, and succeed. So I think that, you know, that Spain does have to learn from some other economies how to speed these
we've barely scratched the surface. I want to have just 10 minutes or so with some questions. I've got a microphone here, so who would like to ask the panel any questions? Sir, yeah, with the reds.
Whoever wants to take it. Andres, MBA student at London Business School. So, Miss Dame Denise brought up the point of these fudges, which are a bit unpalatable, especially for my generation in Spain. Wanted to maybe, it was never really talked much about, but it will be an issue that we can talk about how the constitution was voted in the Basque Country and in Catalonia. Those people will eventually die, and then it will be us who never voted. So wanted to, if you could dive deeper on constitutional reform and maybe better governance practices. Thank you.
Yeah, I do agree with you, and I think that's where I said that we need to reform the constitution. And I think it's, I mean, the own constitution is demanding such a reform or such reforms, because we don't, I'm not speaking about a constituent process, but we have to indicate, we have to know what we want to reform, because otherwise the constitution will lose its integration function. As you said, you are young, and the constitution was voted 40 years ago. So it's time to re-legitimate its legitimacy, its democratic legitimacy, and it is a good thing. So we shouldn't be afraid of reforming it.
Hello, quick question. The people that today are claiming for independence of Catalonia come from groups that not long ago they were supporting the Spanish government. Some of them supported the Constitution, some don't, and they were especially in the period between the late 80s and the early 90s, they were supporting actively to the government. At that period of time, they were in a much better position to claim for independence or constitutional changes. They never did it. Why do you think everything suddenly happened in 2012?
Who would you like to ask?
I think Argelia probably have the best answer, but if anyone wants to make a contribution, that's fine. Yes, and just an appendix. Do you think el 3% has anything to do with that?
I'm sure it has something to do with that. No, I would say that as far as I know, when those being today pro-independence supporters in the Catalan government, they did not claim for any constitutional reform. When Pujol was in the government, he didn't speak about reforming the constitution. I think that, I mean, one of the elements was this constitutional judgment against the Catalan statute. That's an element. The economic crisis, and then this fighting for power between CiU, the center-right nationalist Catalan party, and Esquerra Republicana, those who were independentists from the beginning. This competition made Mas to decide, Artur Mas, the previous president, to go one step forward and to say, well, if I want to win some space within this Catalan space, and I want to keep governing, I want to keep with the power, I have to force a bit the machine, let's say, and to take some of the space of the Esquerra. So it has been. Now I don't remember. Two colleagues of mine have been using this a concept just to explain this fight between these two parties. So there are different elements, not just we want to be independent.
Let's bring the other panel on another issue, if I may. The lady over here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's been quite enriching. There have been a number of references to collective memory, independence of the judiciary, and the long-term impact of various conditions on the younger generation. I would like to ask you a question about the historical memory law of 2007, with all its controversies. Maybe in Spain it's been a point of contention, but internationally in the world of human rights law, it has had a great deal of effect. I would like to find out your views on it, and whoever feels moved to say something, please do.
Well, I'm holding the microphone, so I'll speak. Yes, I personally share your view that at the time when the law was introduced, it was at a moment when people who had a first-hand or possibly second-hand memory of the events of the Civil War were inevitably reaching the end of their lives. And I think myself that it was the right gesture to give people a chance to achieve some closure. As I thought it was the right thing in South Africa or in Northern Ireland. I think there are places where it is useful to be able to deal with it. However, I'm not sure in the circumstances of Spain that it achieved its objectives, because I'm not sure that society was ready to deal with it. So it became confrontational in its own right, and I'm not sure that was necessarily helpful.
When I was studying the history of Spain at university, it was a well-established fact that there was no rich and intellectually valid Spanish historiography of the Civil War, and that most of the scholarship resided outside, partly because the archives hadn't been opened up under Franco, and partly it was felt that Spanish historiography was so riven by the partisanship of the Civil War that you had to rely on others, and it begins with Hugh Thomas and then goes on from there to Preston and so on and so forth. And that is now obviously no longer the case. One, because the archives have been opened up, and two, because there is a liberal, pluralist, noisy democracy which understands that there is no one version of history which manages to outpunch all the others, that history is an argument, which evidence is, of course, central, but between competing interpretations. Spanish historiography of the Civil War is now rich and able. I was very opening remark about the danger of Spanish youth not knowing about the Civil War, and what is the right balance between knowing too much and not knowing enough. And I would say that of all the many miracles, and I just sort of listed a few at the very beginning, which make up modern Spain, possibly the greatest of all, because it's not that long ago, the 1930s. The greatest of all is that families that were riven and regions that were riven and ideologies and the church and the bloodshed and the tumult of the Spanish Civil War has been sufficiently surmounted in the way that modern Spain constructs itself, that the memories haven't totally obliterated what modern Spain might become. I don't know that that was predictable in 1975. When there was interest in the exhumation of graves, and when I was at the tertulias and Zapatero was in full swing, the PP representatives of that particular tertulias were full of anger and indignation about what Zapatero might or might not get up to. But that moment came and went as well. And I come back to my opening gambit, that Spain actually is an incredibly strong country in many, many ways and is able to resist too much historical introspection, which would translate into too much historical anxiety.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the arguments on all sides, and I can remember very much the Ley de Memoria Histórica and the problems it caused. I think I take Mark's points, but I do think there are still very deep-seated memories and divisions in Spain, and I don't think we can ignore that. I think they're there politically. It comes out in political debate in the Cortes. Certain keys are pressed, and you can see the sort of pre-Civil War divisions on show. And I think that is very worrying. And insults are used that go back to the Republic, and so on. So I don't think that there's been a healing process. And unless there is a coming to terms with and understanding what happened, without, at this point of time, trying to put people in prison or whatever. And I think most of the people who are in favor of the Ley de Memoria Histórica, a lot of elderly people, what they want to do is simply find the graves of their loved ones and put them to rest. That's all they want. They don't want revenge. The people that they would want revenge on are no longer there. This is not an issue. But I can well understand somebody saying, I want to find my grandparents. They were shot for no other reason than, on both sides, and I want to put them in a proper grave and feel that, we've come to terms. Now, I don't see that should be a problem, quite frankly. I think the same in Northern Ireland. Until the two communities will never, ever come together, even remotely, until there's a recognition on both sides of the atrocities that were carried out, the innocent people who were shot in the back of the head and buried in a wood or somewhere in the north or in the south. At some point, you have to come to terms with that. I read a very good article this summer in El País about a woman who has a French and a Spanish parents and had lived in France, and said that France has not come to terms with the war, with the collaboration, in the same way that Germany has actually had a process of introspection, of accepting and looking at its Nazi past. That the French have avoided this, that they don't want to look at, what did your father do in the war? It's not a question you want to ask in rural France. But the fact that people are aware that you can't ask these questions seems to me a very good reason why they need to be asked.
Hello. Hello, Julio Bruno, Time Out. Thank you very much for sharing with us today. I just wanted to take it a little bit, something that he thinks that I think about all the time, which is, where is Spain in relationship to the world today? Because it's not just Spain having the problem that we have. We have Brexit here, which is independence of the European Union. We have America, which is independent itself from the world, it seems. So do you think that this is part of that globalization, that the world becomes much smaller and people want to find other ways to express themselves, and this is what is happening? Thank you.
Well, I mean, you're doing fine. You're really doing well. The EU is both cause and reflection of Spanish success. You aren't imperiled by an existential debate about whether you're in or whether you're out. Your language, which was always potent, gets more potent by the day. The broad image of Spain in the world is extremely strong. The Hispanization, at least, of the language in the United States will probably help and make you stronger. The economic development and increasing democracy in Latin America will redound to Spain's favor. You have a tremendous amount going for you. And your international influence is already strong, and I can only see it getting stronger.
My final question, we're going to watch the video, I think, after this one.
Thank you very much. I'm Isabel Del Rio. I'm a writer, I'm a linguist, I'm a Spaniard, and I would like to talk about something that is on everyone's mind here, and it's a six-letter word. I'm talking about the six-letter word, which is Brexit. Now, I'm sorry to bring that up. Nobody brought it up, but I think it's important because it's on everyone's mind here. We're all Spaniards. We've been here for a long time. In my case, I've been here for most of my life. And how do you envisage the future of those Spaniards who are living here? And we don't really know what's going to happen to us. We don't really have it very clear. Should there be contingency measures in place? I understand that the older generation, 80s and 90s, are returning to Spain. They feel betrayed in a way by this country, I'm sorry to say.
a minute each, I think.
Yes, thank you.
Isabel, I don't know what the situation is any more than you do. I mean, I think that is the plain truth of it. My guess is, and it's not based on any evidence, that actually, if you take it 5 years from now, it will be fine. We're in for a bumpy few years, but I would say sit it out. But that is based on absolutely no evidence at all. That's my minute.
Por alusiones. No. On this issue, you can be absolutely calm, right? Because measures have been taken. I can understand your anguish, and we work in order to diminish your anguish. By the way, not only of the 150,000 Spaniards that are here, but as well the 300,000, 400,000 of British. So, because for us, this is family. And from the Spanish point of view and from the British point of view, in the event, let's hope that there is no deal, all things are guaranteed that you are going to stay exactly as you are now, and you are not going to lose any sort of right. You have to go through an administrative procedure of the settled status. I think it's being carried out in a quite a satisfactory way. But if you have any problem, this is your embassy, and all of us will help you in order to surmount this problem.
Can I just say very quickly? I mean, I think I agree with Denise. I mean, I feel betrayed, frankly, by my whatever I want to call them, racist, xenophobic, fascist Brits. But you know, that's just not to go over the top. But yeah, I feel very betrayed. My hope is that at some point we will go back on our knees, crawling. But I think in the next few years, once we get past the Bojo moments, you know, and sanity is restored, we have to come to a transitional period of agreement over trade and other things. And I suspect at the end of it, it will not be a lot different from where we are now. That is my hope, and you know, all we can do is hope. You feel betrayed, I feel betrayed. My wife has lived here for 45 years. And then starts to say, you know, how long do you have to live in a country before you feel that you're accepted? She's paid her taxes, gets a pension and everything. It is an absurdity. It's an absurdity for the hundreds of thousands of Brits living in Spain. I know that the Spanish government and the British government have been working together to protect everybody's rights. So I think we should just, you know, try to ignore the Bojo noises. Yeah? We have an election, we'll have an election, get rid of the bastards. That's all you can do.
I think the video is working. Let's close. Let's watch the video, and then I will say a couple of things at the end.
Lo difícil de la libertad de expresión es que no solamente se puede decir lo que tú crees, sino que también tienes que tragarte, permitir aquellas ideas que son radicalmente opuestas a tus creencias, ¿no?
Puedes querer destruir la democracia y esa democracia no te va a meter en la cárcel por eso. Esta es la mayor grandeza de la democracia, ¿no? Supongo que te lo habrán preguntado muchas veces y no seré original. Exactamente, ¿qué es lo que te llevó a escribir este libro?
Pues en 2011 a mi madre le diagnosticaron un cáncer y se murió muy rápido. Entonces, cuando ella falleció, mi primer impulso fue intentar reconstruir un poco la enfermedad para intentar asimilar lo que acaba de vivir. Cuando estaba pasando por el duelo de mi madre, de repente me encontré con que había como un duelo sin resolver en mi familia. Y estaba ahí como había algo como enquistado. Muchas de las cosas que no me explicaba sobre mi familia tenían un origen en el secuestro y asesinato de mi abuelo en el 77. Durante un montón de años habíamos vivido como tragándonos nuestros temores y nuestros miedos. Mi padre estuvo amenazado por ETA toda la vida, ¿no? Y para no preocuparnos, en vez de contarnos que estaba amenazado, pues se lo tragaba, ¿no? O todos los miedos y todos los temores que había, pues era todo para adentro. Y el resto de la familia, por imitación, pues hacíamos lo mismo.
¿Y a ti te parece que ese duelo pendiente que vosotros teníais en tu familia y que te llevó a escribir el libro es el mismo duelo pendiente que ahora hay en el País Vasco?
La sociedad como sociedad también necesita elaborar los duelos, ¿no? De todos los eventos traumáticos que hay, guerras, terrorismo, ¿no? Yo creo que la sociedad, hay que hacer duelos individuales y duelos colectivos.
¿Y tú tienes alguna idea sobre si ese duelo político y social se está desarrollando, dirías tú, de una manera natural? ¿O parece que se desarrolla pero en realidad no se desarrolla?
Hay mucha gente que todavía le cuesta hablar, ¿no? Hay prueba de ello es que las generaciones más jóvenes a veces hacen como encuestas y eso y no saben quién es Miguel Ángel Blanco, no saben muy bien qué era eso de ETA y yo creo que es porque en sus casas pues no se habla, ¿no? Yo creo que todavía hay mucho silencio, pero bueno, es normal.
Si pasamos de lo individual a lo general, igual no se puede hacer un duelo sin memoria, igual que tú has rescatado la memoria de tu familia en ese libro, quizá no sea posible pasar la página sin hacer memoria, ¿no? Sin que los niños en las escuelas sepan exactamente, por ejemplo, qué es lo que pasó.
Sí, para mí como persona es muy importante reconocer el dolor y buscarle un lugar. Yo creo que como sociedad, no sé cómo se hace, pero creo que como sociedad también es importante reconocer el dolor para poder avanzar, porque si se oculta, ahí hay algo enquistado, hay ese duelo que había, como había en mi familia, enquistado, que no te permite seguir bien, ¿no? Vas como cojo.
Me da que pensar, primero, que la democracia española es tan fuerte como para haber soportado todo ese dolor, que no es un dolor etéreo, que no es un dolor teórico, que son casi 900 muertos con sus familias y con todo el impacto que tuvo en la sociedad y en la política, y sin embargo lo superó. Pero ahora, preguntarse cómo fue posible que conviviéramos con eso, como que nos produce un cierto desasosiego, ¿no? ¿Qué hacíamos? ¿Cómo es posible?
Yo lo que creo es que, por desgracia, haces rutina y te acostumbras a todo.
Sí.
O sea, a mí lo que más me ha llamado la atención es cómo se puede normalizar lo innormalizable. Lo que ha sido increíble es que ha habido gente que ha sido capaz de alzar la voz en esos momentos, ¿no? Y ha habido muchos periodistas durante, bueno, tú lo sabrás, que durante esos años que no se han callado, ¿no? Vamos, sabiendo que se estaban poniendo en el punto de mira, ¿no?
Es verdad que hay muchos periodistas, o que hubo muchos periodistas que rompieron el silencio,
muchos,
con grave peligro.
Muchísimo.
Para su propia integridad,
y la de su familia.
Incluso con atentados que sufrieron, colaborador del Mundo, José Luis López de la Calle, que le mataron precisamente en una circunstancia tan simbólica como la de ir a comprar los periódicos, ¿no? Es como de película, ¿no? Que te asesinen yendo, digamos, a comprar lo que es exactamente la encarnación de la libertad de expresión, ¿no? Que es básica en todas las democracias, igual que los demás sectores. No vamos a ponernos tampoco ninguna medalla especial, ¿no? La responsabilidad de mantener las libertades la tenemos todos. Ha sido en general la democracia española la que de alguna manera la ha derrotado a ETA.
Probablemente. Yo creo que pasado un tiempo se darían cuenta que en un sistema democrático esto no tenía ningún sentido, ¿no? Que las reclamaciones que hacían no necesitaban la violencia, que si quieren un nacionalismo, pues que hay unos cauces democráticos para luchar por él, ¿no?
Tú publicaste este libro y ¿la reacción en tu entorno social cuál fue?
Al hablar en primera persona, ha habido mucha gente que se ha podido identificar conmigo. Muchas veces las víctimas son seres un poco sin cara, ¿no? O sea, son gente que parece que su vida empieza y termina con el atentado.
Que solo son víctimas.
Y yo creo que uno es muchas más cosas, ¿no? Víctima es algo que te toca ser. Y me ha sorprendido cómo gente de ideología de lo más diversa ha sido capaz de conectar con el libro y de entenderlo, ¿no?
¿Y en tu familia?
Procesar un duelo tan íntimo como la muerte de un padre, en el caso de mi padre y sus hermanos, ¿no? Y que a la vez esa cosa tan íntima y tan personal tuya que estás viviendo sea pública y no sea solamente tu historia. A ti te gustaría que ese dolor solamente fuera como para ti, ¿no?
Ya, pero claro, por eso las víctimas del terrorismo no son como las víctimas de los accidentes de tráfico, ¿no?
No, claro.
De alguna manera son víctimas vinculadas a la libertad y a la democracia. Es verdad que la idea de que la sociedad tiene una deuda con las personas que han sido asesinadas precisamente para destruir una democracia y un país, pues es lo que convierte a las víctimas del terrorismo en España y en muchos otros sitios digamos, en propiedad, ¿no? O sea, como si fueran de todos. Si pensamos en el fondo del asunto, todos los acontecimientos que han sucedido en España desde la transición demuestran que la democracia y las leyes amparan a todos, pero no por razones ideológicas, no por razones de ideas, porque las leyes amparan también los derechos de esas personas, que por cierto están ahí porque la gente les vota. Esta es la mayor, digamos, grandeza de la democracia, ¿no? Creo que la libertad de expresión en España es una de las libertades que tiene más garantías. Creo que las instituciones y la propia sociedad son fuertemente defensoras de esa libertad de expresión. No solo en el ámbito jurídico, también en el ámbito social. Creo que es la propia sociedad la que hace que la libertad de expresión en España haya tenido un desarrollo normativo muy garantista y tenga un reflejo real tan importante en la sociedad. Hasta cierto punto es un ejercicio intelectual importante, ¿no? Combatir, digamos, establecer un combate ideológico, ¿no? En el debate público o en los medios a propósito de determinadas ideas. Y creo que eso es lo que hace crecer un país, ¿no? Y es lo que conciencia de alguna manera a las personas, ¿no? Y a las sociedades. O sea, en ese sentido yo creo que el debate
es enriquecedor.
Es enriquecedor y es muy plural el que hay en España, desde luego.